The night air buzzed with tension, thick with the static of radio chatter and the distant crack of gunfire. Staff Sergeant Eric Lawson moved low and fast, rifle raised, his boots kicking up clouds of sand as he darted behind a half-cracked stone wall. Beside him moved Shadow, silent and sure-footed, his black and tan coat nearly invisible in the moonlight. The German Shepherd didn't flinch as bullets echoed from somewhere over the ridge. He was trained for this, born for it, and Eric trusted him more than any man in the unit. "Contact east side," came the voice through the comms. "Eyes on movement, multiple." Eric tapped twice on his mic and motioned for Shadow to flank left. The dog obeyed instantly, darting ahead with the precision of a ghost, disappearing into the brush that clung to the edges of the compound. Their mission was simple in theory: recon, intel extraction, and exfil. But nothing about this region had been simple for months. Every path was a trap, every silence, a lie. The village ruins around them whispered of something older than war: crumbling buildings, torn prayer flags, broken doors hanging on rusted hinges. Somewhere in that wreckage, a cache of enemy supplies had been confirmed, guarded by militants who didn't care about rules of engagement. What they cared about was chaos, and that was exactly what they were unleashing. A flash lit the horizon, bright, violent, too close. The blast shook the ground beneath Eric's boots and hurled him backward into the wall. His helmet clanged against the rock. Dust filled his lungs. The radio went dead. For a moment, the world was nothing but noise and heat. He scrambled up, heart pounding, ears ringing, and looked for Shadow. "Shadow!" he called, voice raw, searching through the haze. "Shadow, heal!" Nothing, just the crackle of fire spreading through the eastern side of the structure, the scent of charred stone, screams in the distance, and no sign of the dog who'd been at his side every moment of the last 3 years. Eric pushed through the rubble, ignoring the pain in his leg. He called again and again, whistled, swore, pleaded. "Come on, boy, come back. You're not done. I'm not done." But the only thing that came back was silence. When the dust finally settled and the unit regrouped, the reports started to come in. Casualties, wounded, missing. Shadow's name was among them. For 2 days, Eric refused to leave. He retraced every step, scoured every building, talked to villagers, followed rumors, questioned everything. He found a bloody paw print near the ridge, but no trail, no body, no collar, just a smear of truth that wasn't enough. The decision came from command. They couldn't risk more lives. Shadow was presumed lost, presumed dead. Eric signed the paperwork with shaking hands. Back at base, they handed him Shadow's service vest folded tight like a flag, a small brass plaque with the dog's name, a commendation for bravery. He didn't take it home. He left it in his duffel and never opened it again. In the months that followed, people told him he was lucky, that he came back alive, that he did everything he could. But none of it mattered, because the one soul who would have stayed by his side through anything hadn't made it home. And Eric didn't feel alive. He felt hollow. They held a memorial. Eric didn't speak. He couldn't. He stood in uniform at the edge of the crowd and stared at the empty podium where Shadow's leash rested on a hook. He should have been buried, honored, laid to rest with dignity, but there was no grave. Just a void in Eric's chest that grew larger with every sunrise. Shadow had saved lives, found explosives, detected traps, comforted soldiers in their worst moments, and in the end, he vanished without a trace. No final bark, no cry, just smoke, fire, and the kind of silence that never ends. Eric left the military 6 months later. He didn't talk about the war, didn't talk about Shadow. The world moved on, but part of him never did. Because you don't just lose a dog like Shadow, you lose a piece of yourself with him. The plane touched down with a groan of wheels and metal, but Eric barely felt it. His body was here, sure, knees stiff from hours of stillness, uniform neat and pressed, but his mind was somewhere else, far from the crowd waiting behind the barriers at the airbase. He walked down the ramp in silence, duffel over one shoulder, sunglasses hiding the heaviness in his eyes. The sun looked different in the States, brighter, cleaner, but none of it reached him. There was no welcoming committee for him, no excited family waving signs, just his commanding officer with a somber nod and a black car waiting nearby. Eric had insisted. No speeches, no ceremony, just the paperwork and whatever they felt obligated to hand him. They drove in silence. Windows cracked just enough to let in the spring breeze. It smelled like grass and fresh pavement. Nothing like the dust-choked wind he'd breathed for the last year. That wind had been bitter and dry, thick with heat and memory. And somewhere in it, always was Shadow, panting beside him, alert, focused, alive. Now there was only the sound of tires on asphalt and the quiet crackling of his thoughts unraveling. When they arrived, a small table had been set up in a quiet corner of the base office. On it lay a triangle folded flag, crisp and sharp, resting beside a plaque engraved with Shadow's name and rank. Military Working Dog, Shadow, K9 Specialist. Beneath it, a medal in a velvet box. Valor, service, sacrifice. Eric stared at it, but didn't reach out. His hands twitched at his sides, unsure what to do. He hadn't prepared for this. Not really. He had imagined a reunion, even after the declaration, even after the memorial. He'd held on to some piece of himself that believed he'd turn around one day and see a black and tan shape trotting toward him, tail high, eyes sharp, ready for orders. Instead, he stood there alone. The officer spoke quietly. "He saved a lot of lives, Sergeant. He deserves to be remembered." Eric's jaw tightened. He deserved more than a plaque. He picked up the folded flag, held it for a second too long, then nodded and walked away. No photos, no handshakes. Just the clink of the metal in his pocket and the weight of a name that had no grave. Back home, the world didn't stop for his return. The streets buzzed with everyday noise. Kids on bikes, lawnmowers, dogs barking in fenced yards. It all felt foreign, like he'd walked into someone else's life and was pretending it was his. He moved into a small rental house on the edge of town. Nothing fancy. A one-story with peeling paint and creaky floors. It didn't need to be much. He wasn't expecting company. He set Shadow's vest on a chair and left it there. The duffel bag stayed packed for weeks. He'd lie awake at night, eyes on the ceiling, listening to the silence. Sometimes in that stillness, he swore he could hear nails clicking across the floor or the soft huff of a dog settling down at the foot of his bed. But every time he looked, there was nothing. People called, friends from the unit, a few old high school buddies who'd heard he was back. He let the phone ring. After a while, it stopped. His sister stopped by once. She brought groceries and asked questions with her eyes, but he didn't offer answers. How could he explain that he'd left part of himself in a place no one here could picture? That he didn't come back whole? She stood in the doorway that day, watching him feed the silence with stares. "You should talk to someone," she said gently. "I am," he replied, nodding toward Shadow's vest. She didn't come back after that. Weeks turned into months. Eric took a job doing security detail at a warehouse. Night shifts, quiet hours, less talking, more shadows. It suited him. He didn't have to smile, didn't have to pretend he was okay. He walked to work most nights, sometimes catching himself looking over his shoulder like he used to in the field, half expecting to see a familiar silhouette trotting behind him. It was muscle memory, instinct, but it always ended the same way. Alone. And the worst part wasn't the silence. It wasn't the nights or the questions or the metal that meant nothing. The worst part was the not knowing. No body, no collar, no final goodbye. Just a scar in his memory where his partner should have been. That kind of guilt doesn't fade. It settles. Deep. And for Eric, moving on wasn't about time. It was about the one mission he never completed. The one partner he never brought home. The third year home was worse than the first two. Time didn't smooth anything out. It just wore things down. Wore him down. At first, people gave Eric space, thinking maybe he just needed a little more time to adjust. But when birthdays passed unanswered, holidays slipped by with no replies, they began to forget. Or maybe they moved on, the way the world tends to do when someone disappears in plain sight. Eric's house aged with him. The porch sagged a little more each season. The grass grew taller than it should. A stack of unopened mail leaned against the wall by the front door, untouched. Inside, the air was heavy, windows often left closed, curtains drawn, sunlight leaking through only in thin, dusty strips. Some days were quiet, just the kind of quiet he used to crave. But other days, the worst days, were filled with sounds he couldn't explain. A scrape across the floor, a breath behind him, a low chuff of air, as if a dog had just let out a sigh and settled down to rest. He'd whirl around, hand twitching, heart racing, but there was never anything there. The first time it happened, he told himself it was just his mind playing tricks, a dream bleeding into wakefulness. But then it kept happening. At night, the sounds grew louder. Sometimes he'd sit up in bed, certain he'd heard paws pacing in the hall, or a bark, faint, distant, but unmistakable. He checked the locks, checked the windows, checked the vest still sitting on the same chair it had been placed on the day he moved in. It was still there, still untouched. He started sleeping on the couch, the living room light left on, like a campfire against the darkness. But it didn't help. If anything, the silence felt louder when the world dimmed. And in that silence, memory had a way of creeping in. He saw it every time he closed his eyes. The flash, the smoke, the sound of shadow barking, sharp, urgent, just before the blast cut it off. The way the world seemed to blur and twist after that. The scramble, the search, the way his heart cracked open when he found that paw print in the dust and nothing else. He told himself Shadow was gone. Had to be. No dog survived alone that long out there. Not without help. And if there was help, they would have brought him back, right? But some nights, in the dimness of half sleep, he wasn't sure anymore. There were moments, a flicker of movement by the back door, a silhouette by the fence, that made his breath hitch. He'd get up, slow and cautious, his old instincts lighting up like flares. But when he looked, there'd be nothing. Just wind, or shadows, or the ache of wanting something to be real so badly it rewired his senses. His therapist said it was trauma, that the brain finds ways to hold on to what it lost, especially when grief comes without a body, without finality. Eric nodded when she said that, but he didn't go back. Words weren't cutting it. He tried volunteering at a local shelter once, walked dogs, cleaned cages. For a while it felt like it might help. One shepherd in particular caught his eye. Same build, same coloring. He'd stare at the dog too long, and the shelter staff would exchange glances. They didn't say anything, but they didn't need to. One afternoon when that shepherd was adopted, Eric stood by the chain-link fence and watched the dog leave, tail wagging, eyes bright. It was a good match, he told himself. Good family. But that night, he went home, poured a drink he didn't want, and sat on the porch for hours. He didn't speak, didn't cry, just stared out into the night, waiting for something he couldn't name. His dreams worsened that year. Sometimes he'd dream of the mission playing backward, the explosion unhappening, the sounds reversing, Shadow running toward him instead of away. Other times he'd wake up gasping, sweat-drenched, heart hammering, with the ghost of a bark still echoing in his ears. He stopped wearing his old dog tags, stopped checking the news, stopped looking at the emails from old friends who still reached out now and then. Time didn't bring peace, it brought stillness, but not the kind you rest in, the kind you drown in. The rain had started hours ago, steady and cold, drumming against the roof like a steady heartbeat. Eric sat in his usual spot by the living room window, a lukewarm cup of coffee cradled between his hands. The porch light flickered every few minutes, casting shadows that stretched and twisted across the floor. Outside, the world was gray and drowning, the kind of night where no one visited. No one should be out at all. He wasn't expecting anyone. He never did. That's why the knock made his skin go cold. It wasn't loud, just a quiet tap, then another, almost hesitant. Not the kind of knock that came with urgency or anger, the kind that asked for something. Eric stared at the door for a few seconds, unsure if he'd imagined it. The clock ticked slowly on the wall behind him. Nothing else moved. He set down his cup and stood, one hand instinctively brushing the edge of the side table where his old service pistol still rested, untouched for years. He didn't take it. just placed his palm flat on the door and listened. Another knock, this time softer. His gut tightened. He turned the handle slowly and pulled the door open just enough to look out. And then he stopped breathing. Standing in the rain, soaked through, mud caked on his legs and water dripping from his ears, was a German Shepherd. Graying muzzle, one cloudy eye, a long scar across his snout that hadn't been there before. Thin, worn, but upright. Shadow. The dog didn't move. He just stood there, staring up at Eric through the storm. He didn't bark, didn't whine, just waited, like time meant nothing to him. Eric's lips parted, but nothing came out. His throat clenched. The porch light flickered again and held. For a long, trembling second, neither of them moved. Then Shadow stepped forward, slowly, as if unsure if he was welcome. His paws made soft squelching sounds against the porch wood, tail low, not wagging, just there. He stopped at the threshold and sat. Eric dropped to his knees and his voice cracked. Shadow? The dog's ears twitched. He leaned in slightly, his nose brushing against Eric's hand. That touch, warm and wet and real, broke something inside him. He reached forward, hands trembling as he touched Shadow's neck, then ran them up behind his ears. The fur was coarse and tangled, cold from the rain, but it was his. It was him. Eric swallowed the sob rising in his chest and whispered, "You're not real." Shadow leaned in further, resting his head against Eric's shoulder. Not a trick of the light, not a dream, not a sound in the hallway. Real. Eric wrapped his arms around the dog, pulling him in close. His shirt soaked through instantly, but he didn't care. He felt the weight of Shadow's body against his chest, felt the dog's ribs, the subtle tremble in his legs, the heartbeat thudding steady beneath the damp fur. How? He pulled back just enough to look at him. Shadow blinked, slowly, as if the years had taken their toll. That cloudy eye gave him a strange, distant look, but the other one. The other was clear and sharp, the same eye that had locked onto threats in the dark, scanned corners of bombed-out buildings, watched Eric's back when no one else could. "I looked for you," Eric whispered. "I looked for so long." Shadow didn't answer, but he didn't have to. He just lowered his head slightly, pushing it into Eric's chest like he used to after missions, when the adrenaline faded and all that was left was relief. Eric stood and opened the door wide. "Come in!" Shadow hesitated for half a second before stepping into the house. His paws left prints across the wooden floor. Eric didn't wipe them up. He couldn't stop staring. Shadow sniffed the air, then slowly made his way to the corner where his old vest still sat on the chair. Dusty, untouched, preserved like a shrine. He sniffed it once, then twice. Sat down. Eric collapsed onto the couch, heart pounding. He didn't know what to say, what to feel. Was he supposed to call someone? A vet? A reporter? None of it mattered. Shadow was here. The rain kept falling outside and Eric didn't move for hours. He just sat in silence, watching the dog that was never supposed to come home finally fall asleep on the rug. And for the first time in years, the silence wasn't empty. It was whole. The morning after Shadow's return came with heavy light and heavier questions. The storm had passed sometime during the night, leaving behind a gray hush that settled over the house like dust. Eric hadn't slept. He hadn't dared to. He'd watched the dog breathe instead, counting each slow, deliberate rise and fall of the chest. The rhythm grounded him. It told him that this wasn't another hallucination born from guilt or insomnia. Shadow was real. Here. But was it truly him? He didn't rush. He moved slow, methodical, the way he had on patrol, as if any sudden move might cause the moment to vanish. The dog was still asleep on the rug, curled tight but not trembling. The scar was more visible now in the light, long, pink, and jagged across the bridge of his snout. Eric stared at it, remembering the day that wound was earned. A collapsed wall, the mission in the dry village near Kandahar. Shadow had taken the hit shielding him from falling debris. The vet said it would leave a mark. It had. Eric crouched low, reached forward, and gently parted the fur near Shadow's neck. No collar. But there was something else. A flash of metal tucked close to the skin. a tag nearly fused to the old chain. The edges were blackened, the surface warped and melted. He slid it out carefully, trying not to wake the dog. It was a military-issue ID tag, or what was left of one. Eric held it in his palm, the metal warm from Shadow's body. The letters were faint, some almost erased by heat or friction, but his breath caught when he saw what remained. Shad K9, U.S. The rest was gone, but it was enough. His fingers tightened around the tag as his throat closed. This wasn't just some stray with a similar coat. This wasn't coincidence or wishful thinking. This was Shadow. His shadow. Scarred, older, worn down, but alive. He reached for his phone but hesitated. Who would he call? What would he even say? I lost a military working dog in combat 5 years ago. He showed up at my house last night with a melted tag and half a memory. Number, not yet, not until he was sure. He stood and moved to the kitchen, filling a bowl with water and grabbing what little food he had, some leftover chicken and rice. Shadow stirred at the smell, lifting his head slowly. There was no immediate reaction, no tail wag, no spark of recognition, just a cautious glance and a sniff of the air. Eric placed the bowl down gently, then stepped back. Shadow sniffed once, then again. Finally, he got up, gingerly, like his joints weren't what they used to be, and patted over. He didn't eat fast. No desperation, just quiet hunger, as if food was something he'd learned to pace over the years. Eric watched every move. You remember me? He asked softly. Shadow didn't respond, didn't look up, just kept eating. Eric lowered himself onto the floor, resting against the kitchen wall. His eyes fell to the ID tag in his hand again. He rubbed his thumb over the half-formed letters, trying to imagine the journey they'd both been on. How did you get out of there? He remembered the explosion like it had happened yesterday. The blast had separated them. Dirt and debris had swallowed everything. Eric had been pulled from the rubble hours later. Shadow hadn't been found. They searched for days, weeks. The assumption was that Shadow had been killed or taken or simply lost in terrain no dog could survive. Eric had resisted that last idea the most. Shadow wasn't just any dog. He had training, instincts, but even hope has limits. Eventually, he was declared MIA, then presumed KIA. They gave Eric a folded flag in his honor, and now here he was. Shadow finished eating and turned to look at Eric. Their eyes met. For a moment, Eric saw something flicker behind the dog's gaze, something caught between recognition and confusion, like a melody half-remembered. Eric held out the tag. You carried this all the way back to me, he whispered, even if you didn't know why. Shadow stepped forward, not close enough to touch, not yet, but close enough for Eric to see the tension in his shoulders ease, close enough for the silence to feel less empty. Maybe the memories weren't gone. Maybe they were just buried. Eric didn't push. He just sat there, legs stretched out, the tag resting in his palm. The scar on Shadow's snout caught the morning light, a line etched by time and war, and maybe fate. He didn't need Shadow to react, not yet, because he was here, and that was the start. The house creaked with the weight of the wind. Another storm was rolling through, late spring, sharp and full of sound. The kind that rattled window panes and woke memories, best left buried. Eric stood in the hallway watching the rain run in streaks down the glass, a familiar weight pulling at his shoulders. The lights flickered, then steadied. The scent of wet earth filtered in through the old wooden frames. Shadow lay curled in the corner of the living room again, near the cold fireplace. His eyes were half closed, ears flicking at every distant rumble of thunder. Eric had been watching him all day, carefully, quietly, trying to find a trace of the dog he once knew. He'd tried everything, commands they'd used in the field, phrases that had meant the difference between life and death. Guard. Nothing. Search. Blank eyes. Even his name, his real name, brought little more than a subtle tilt of the head, like the syllables stirred something, but not enough to reach whatever place the dog's mind had locked away. Eric had even laid out the old vest again. He'd placed it gently near the rug, unfolded, the patches still intact, though faded. Shadow had sniffed it, circled it once, then turned away and lay back down. It wasn't rejection, it was something more distant, hesitant, as if the dog recognized the pieces, but not the whole. Eric didn't blame him. Trauma had a way of erasing, not all at once, but in layers like sand slipping through fingers. You held on tight, but it still disappeared. He tried again before bed. He knelt beside the rug, kept his voice low and steady. "Sit," he said softly. Shadow blinked at him. Eric adjusted his tone, sharper now, with a rhythm they used to train with. "Sit!" Shadow looked away. Eric closed his eyes, nodded once to himself. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." He left the dog be, climbed into bed and stared at the ceiling while thunder cracked overhead. He didn't expect sleep. He hadn't in years. But somehow, sleep found him. And with it came the nightmare. It was always the same. Dust choking the sky, the ring of gunfire far too close, and the silence that came after the explosion. The part where he turned and Shadow was gone. That endless spinning panic, the screaming in his chest, the digging through rubble with raw hands, calling a name no one could answer to. Then the sound, low, sharp, final, the one that told him Shadow was lost. Eric sat bolt upright in bed, chest heaving, hands gripping the sheets like they were a lifeline. The wind outside howled. The rain hammered the roof like boots on gravel. His throat felt raw. He hadn't screamed out loud, but it was close. And that's when he felt it. The weight on the bed. Shadow had climbed up, quiet as smoke, and now lay beside him, not curled or cautious, but stretched out lengthwise, head on his paws, one eye watching him carefully. Calm, present. Eric didn't move. The dog didn't nudge him, didn't lick his hand, didn't whimper. He just stayed there, like a sentry on duty, like he used to. It wasn't recognition in the way Eric had hoped for. It wasn't the tail wag or the obedient posture. It was something else. Instinct, maybe, or bond. Something deeper than memory. "I'm okay," Eric whispered hoarsely. Shadow didn't respond. Eric reached out and laid a hand gently on the dog's shoulder. The fur was damp, not from rain, but from the walk across the house. Shadow had come from his place by the fireplace, padded through the dark storm, climbed onto the bed and laid down without hesitation. Not for comfort, for protection. Eric turned his head and looked at him. "You still remember how to keep watch." Shadow didn't blink. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside, the room was still. The air was thick with something unspoken, but heavy enough to fill the space between them. Eric didn't sleep much the rest of the night, but he didn't need to. He just lay there, hand resting on Shadow's side, listening to the steady rhythm of breathing beside him, the kind that said, "I'm here. I've got you." And for the first time since the knock at the door, Eric let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, the dog was coming home after all. Eric sat in front of his old laptop. The keys faded from time and frustration. The cursor blinked in the center of a search bar, taunting him. For the past 2 hours, he had scoured message boards, buried forums, and unofficial veteran networks. The kind of places where stories still lived long after missions were scrubbed from record. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then slowly, he typed, K9 MIA Kandahar 2017. German Shepherd, scar across snout, survived. He hit enter. The results were a mess. Scattered articles, links to defunct blogs, and posts from people searching for long-lost units or patches of identity. But Eric wasn't looking for closure. Not anymore. He was looking for confirmation, a thread, a sign that the past 5 years weren't just a blur of guilt and hallucination. He wanted to believe that Shadow didn't just survive, that he lived, that he mattered. A ping echoed through the speakers, an alert from a forum buried deep in the web, one he hadn't logged into since leaving the military. A thread had updated. The subject line read, Ghost Dog of Argandab. Eric clicked. The post was new, fresh. Only 3 comments, each more cryptic than the last. But the original post told a story that made his heart skip a beat. It described a village nestled deep in a ravine, one that had been left uninhabitable after a landmine scare. Locals refused to return. Then one day a dog appeared, gray, grizzled, a scar across his face. He patrolled the area daily, barking at certain patches of earth, digging cautiously in others. Over time, villagers followed his lead. Eventually, demining crews came in, guided by the disturbed ground the dog had targeted. Over a dozen live mines were found. Not one detonation. The dog vanished afterward. No one knew where he came from. They just called him the Guardian. Eric stared at the screen, reading the paragraph over and over. The scar, the behavior, the sudden disappearance. It had to be him. He scrolled to the comments. One from a medic. Heard the same story near Spinboldak. Locals said the dog wouldn't let anyone near the old mountain pass. Stayed up there for months. Wouldn't come down even when it snowed. Another from a translator who had worked briefly in the region. Called him the ghost dog. Showed up after ambushes. Never took food. Just watched. The last comment was a simple one. Some dogs forget, but some wait. Eric leaned back in his chair, heart pounding. His mind raced through the timeline. If Shadow had survived that explosion, crawled from the rubble, what then? He was trained for endurance, for resilience. He knew how to stay hidden, how to avoid threats, how to work even without direction. What if he kept doing the only thing he knew how to do? Protect, even without a handler, even without orders. Just protect. Eric pushed away from the desk, pacing the room. Every step echoed with a kind of urgency that felt like breath catching in his chest. He opened his closet, dug through the worn duffel bags until he found what he was looking for, his old deployment journal. Most of it was notes on missions, scattered thoughts scrawled in half-darkness. But there were pages about Shadow, training notes, behavioral quirks, how he'd react to certain noises, how he used to circle twice before laying down, how he always refused food from strangers. Eric flipped through the pages like a man chasing ghosts until one small detail stopped him. A note from their final mission. Shadow had reacted to the distant whistle of incoming fire long before any of the team heard it. He had crouched low, ears pinned, eyes locked on a horizon none of them could see. Eric had written one word next to it, seventh sense. Now, as thunder rolled across the horizon again, Eric turned toward the living room. Shadow lay near the door, alert but resting. Not watching Eric, watching the world beyond the windows. "What did you see out there?" Eric murmured. "What kept you going?" The dog didn't react, but the silence between them felt thinner now. He reached for his phone, opened a messaging app, and typed out a single message to a former squadmate, the one who used to handle satellite intel. "You ever hear about a dog saving a village near Argandab? Scar across his face? German Shepherd. Might have been one of ours." The reply came a few minutes later. "I've heard the story, thought it was a legend." Eric stared at the message. Maybe it was. But legends had to come from somewhere. And this one was asleep in his house, tail twitching at dreams only he could remember. The morning air was cool and quiet, laced with the scent of damp soil and pine. A low fog clung to the edges of the yard like breath on a window, softening everything in sight. Eric stood at the back porch, one hand cradling a chipped mug of coffee, the other loosely holding a faded green tennis ball, worn smooth over time, the fuzz gone in patches, like memory rubbed too often. He hadn't touched it in years. It had sat in a box at the bottom of the closet, tucked away with a tangle of paracord and a chewed-up training sleeve. Shadow's things, or what was left of them. The dog now sat at the edge of the grass just beyond the porch steps, head high, ears twitching with every faint sound. Birds chirping, a squirrel darting across the fence, the slow hum of a neighbor's lawnmower far off in the distance. Shadow didn't move, but Eric could see the way his eyes scanned everything, that familiar hyper-awareness, the kind you never really unlearn. Eric glanced at the ball again. His thumb ran over a shallow bite mark near the seam. He remembered the last time Shadow had chased it. Base camp, mid-tour, a break between patrols. The entire squad had laughed as Shadow bolted after it, like it was the most important mission of his life. He'd returned with the ball clutched tightly in his jaws, tail wagging for the first time in days. Now Eric took a breath, stepped off the porch, and called softly, You remember this, boy? Shadow's head tilted, one ear cocked, his gaze locking on the ball. Not recognition, not yet, but interest. Eric raised his arm and lobbed the ball across the yard. Not far, just enough to send it bouncing unevenly over the grass. For a second, everything held still. Then Shadow moved. Not a slow approach, not a tentative walk. He ran. The movement was fluid, natural, pure muscle and memory colliding. He reached the ball, skidded slightly on the damp grass, then picked it up in his mouth, turned, looked at Eric, and brought it back. Eric's chest clenched. Shadow didn't drop the ball immediately. He stopped a few feet away, watching Eric with something unreadable in his eyes. Not fear, not confusion. It was almost like he was waiting. For permission, maybe. Or praise. Eric crouched slowly, eyes level. "Good boy," he said, barely more than a whisper. "Real good boy." Shadow stepped forward, dropped the ball at his feet, then sat. No tail wag, no celebratory bark. But it didn't matter. It was something. Eric reached out, hands shaking just slightly, and brushed his fingers over the top of Shadow's head. The dog didn't flinch. He didn't look away. Instead, he closed his eyes for a moment, just long enough to make Eric's throat tighten. It wasn't full trust, but it was a crack in the wall. They stayed like that for a long minute, man and dog, past and present, a silence that didn't demand to be filled. Then Eric picked up the ball again. "One more." Shadow stood before the word had fully left his mouth. Eric threw. Shadow chased. And when he returned, he dropped the ball right into Eric's palm. Something had shifted. A gear turning slowly in an old rusted machine. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic. Just the sound of something beginning to move again after being stuck for too long. Later that morning, Eric watched from the kitchen window as Shadow paced the perimeter of the yard. He marked the corners like he used to, paused by the old shed as if checking for threats that didn't exist. His tail hung loose, not stiff with fear anymore, but relaxed, settled. Eric leaned on the counter, letting the steam from his coffee fog the glass. He didn't say anything. Didn't need to, because something was coming back. Not just memory, but purpose. The sense of being needed, of belonging. Eric didn't know how long it would last, how far they could rebuild what was lost. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was talking to a ghost. Shadow was here, and he was starting to remember. The old flash drive was scuffed and dented, barely hanging together after years of being jammed into pockets, bags, and forgotten corners of drawers. Eric had almost tossed it out once. He hadn't known what was on it, just another leftover piece of the life he'd shut away. But tonight, something tugged at him, a gut feeling, or maybe just hope masquerading as instinct. He sat on the edge of his bed, laptop open, the glow from the screen painting his tired face in blue light. Outside, the wind stirred the trees into quiet conversation. Inside, the house was still. Shadow lay in the doorway, half asleep, his breathing slow and even. A faint whistle with each exhale, the kind of sound that used to comfort Eric on deployment. Proof that someone else was there, alive, watching. Eric clicked a file. It wasn't labeled, just a date, one that hit him in the stomach the moment he saw it, the week before they were separated. Audio crackled through the speakers, grainy, low quality. He heard boots scuffing on dirt, faint radio chatter, and then his own voice, younger and sharper, calling out into the distance. "Shadow, seek!" A pause then, in the background, the unmistakable sound of paws kicking up sand, a bark, and a round of laughter from the squad. Eric's laugh among them. He hadn't expected the reaction. From the doorway, Shadow stirred, his ears twitched, his head rose slowly. Eric held his breath. Another command from the recording. "Left flank, clear it." Shadow stood. He didn't just rise, he moved like something had clicked into place, like a door creaked open in the back of his mind, and suddenly he knew the way through. He turned toward Eric, eyes wide and sharp, his entire body alert, but not tense. Eric couldn't speak. He didn't dare. The dog took a single step forward, eyes locked on him now, as if seeing him not just as the man in the room, but the one who used to wear the uniform, The one who held the leash, gave the orders, threw the ball, shared the silence of long nights in strange places. Eric clicked another file, a different mission, a moment he barely remembered recording. His voice rang out again, stronger this time. Shadow, heal. And Shadow moved, not perfectly, a little slower than he used to. Age had crept in, carved lines through muscle and softened reflexes. But it was there. He walked across the room and sat at Eric's side, just as he once had in the belly of armored trucks, or outside hastily built bunkers, or by the shattered remains of a wall in a village whose name Eric no longer remembered. Eric reached out, one hand shaking, and rested it on Shadow's neck. "You didn't forget," he whispered. "You were just waiting." Shadow leaned in, pressing his weight into Eric's side, not with hesitation, not with fear, but with a quiet certainty, a claiming. "I thought you were gone," Eric said softly, fingers curling into the fur at Shadow's shoulder. "I thought maybe it was all in my head." The dog didn't move. He didn't have to. Eric's throat closed around the lump that had been there for 5 years. The grief, the guilt, the endless what-ifs, all of it suddenly felt lighter. Not gone, but shared. He sat on the floor now, the laptop screen still flickering behind him, the echo of his own voice looping gently through the speakers. Shadow didn't flinch at the sounds anymore. If anything, he seemed steadier, as if the familiar cadence of Eric's voice from the past reminded him of who he was supposed to be. Who they were supposed to be. Not broken, not lost, just apart for a while. Eric leaned his head against Shadow's and let the silence stretch. No command, no mission, just a moment where everything made sense again. And in that moment, he knew. Shadow hadn't forgotten. He had just needed to know it was okay to remember. The sun was beginning to sink behind the tall trees that bordered the backyard, casting long shadows that stretched across the patchy grass. The sky burned with soft streaks of orange and violet, the last light of day wrapping everything in gold. Eric sat with his back against the old oak tree, legs stretched out in front of him, a half-finished beer resting in the dirt at his side. The air was cool, quiet, and smelled faintly of pine and soil. Peace distilled into its simplest form. Shadow lay next to him, his body pressed lightly against Eric's thigh. No leash, no collar, just him, just there. Not as a soldier, not as a ghost, but as home. Eric glanced down at him, at the way the dog's eyes followed the sway of leaves, the way his chest rose and fell in a rhythm that somehow synced with Eric's own breathing. There was a calmness now, in both of them, that hadn't been there in years. Not since before that last mission. Not since the moment everything split. He reached out, fingers sliding into the coarse fur along Shadow's shoulder, and gave a gentle scratch. Shadow didn't flinch. He didn't tense. He simply leaned into it, eyelids drooping with trust that felt deeper than anything Eric could put into words. The past few weeks had been like learning a language they once knew fluently, but hadn't spoken in years. At first, the words came slow, the meanings unsure, but then one came easier, then another. And before long, they weren't just remembering each other. They were rebuilding something that hadn't been lost, only buried. Shadow had started sleeping beside the bed. He had begun responding to familiar commands, not because he was ordered, but because he wanted to. The tail wags were slower, tempered by age, but real. The spark behind his eyes no longer flickered like a failing light. It burned now, steady, quiet, present. Eric tilted his head back and stared up at the canopy of branches above them, a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "You found your way back," he said quietly. "All this time, and you still found me." Shadow didn't react. He didn't need to. Just being here like this was answer enough. Eric thought about those years in between, the hollow ones, the sleepless ones, how he'd convinced himself that Shadow was gone forever, that nothing would bring him back, that it was easier to close the door and never look behind it. But Shadow had found it anyway, had nudged it open with his nose, with his paws, with the steady patience of someone who knows exactly how long healing takes and refuses to rush it. He hadn't come back just to be rescued. He had come back to rescue. Eric reached for the old tennis ball that now lived permanently near the base of the tree. He didn't throw it, just rolled it gently toward Shadow's paws. Shadow looked at it, then at Eric, and with a soft grunt of effort, he nudged it back. No urgency, no fanfare, just the rhythm of two beings who didn't need much more than each other. The breeze picked up as the sun slipped lower. Crickets began their chorus somewhere in the tall grass. The world moved on, but for Eric and Shadow, time had slowed. Just enough for this, just enough for stillness, for belonging. Eric leaned forward, hand resting gently over the scar near Shadow's shoulder. "You're home for good now," he whispered. "No more missions, no more waiting. We're done, partner." Shadow's tail thumped once against the ground. Just once, but it was enough. Eric closed his eyes, letting the quiet settle in, letting himself believe it was real, because it was. Shadow had come back, not just from the other side of war, but from the other side of memory. He hadn't just returned to the doorstep, he'd crossed something deeper, and in doing so, he brought Eric back with him. Back to the light, back to trust, back to peace. The kind of peace that only comes when you finally stop surviving and start living again. Together. If this story moved you, if Shadow's return reminded you of the unbreakable bond between loyalty and love, don't forget to subscribe. Every story we tell is about more than just a moment. It's about memory, courage, and healing. Join us for more powerful stories that deserve to be remembered. Tap that subscribe button so you never miss the next chapter in the journeys that matter most.